All right, welcome back to the Protocol Town Hall, a periodic guest talk series focused on protocols and protocol research. In today's guest talk, we'll be speaking with Josh Stark from the Ethereum Foundation on a concept that we've talked a great deal about, hardness. There will be a link in the YouTube chat to the Summer of Protocols forum where you can post any conversation, but also feel free to do so in the YouTube comments. Our next town hall will be a researcher salon on next Wednesday, the 24th, with Kara Kittel and Toby Shoren, and they'll be talking about their Summer of Protocols Cohort 1 research project. You can find out more about the Summer Protocols, its Cohort 1 research, the guest talk calendar, as well as the protocol kit at summerofprotocols.com. And with that, I will hand it off to Tim today to introduce our guest speaker. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah. Well, Josh works at the Ethereum Foundation with me, and I think you're one of the people who spend the most time trying to think through the implications of Ethereum. So for many years, you had your This Year in Ethereum blog posts where you would document literally every single thing that happened on Ethereum throughout the year. And then over the past couple of years, it seems like you've shifted to a more meta level where you tried to think about what are like the unique properties that blockchains give us? Why are they special? How do they compare to other things? I think this is really relevant to the stuff we talked about in several protocols, where we're trying to understand sort of these common threads across protocols, whether they're blockchain technology protocols or things from completely different domains. So yeah, I think that the frame of reference you had in your atoms, institutions, and blockchains piece around hardness is very, very useful to think about, not just blockchains, but protocols generally. So over to you, Josh.
Thank you, Tim, for the kind introduction. Okay, so yeah, thank you, everybody. This is a talk that I've given a couple times now, although every time I do it, I kind of adapt it a little bit and make iterative progress. So this is as much for me about sharing with all of you, and also a way to really make progress on these ideas, which I think honestly are still in kind of a draft form. And I want to recruit you and other people you may know to help work on these ideas together, because I can't do it on my own. So let's jump in. Okay, so I'm Josh. I work at the Ethereum Foundation, where I serve as part of the leadership team. And I've been working at the EF since about 2019 on a few special projects, and in this role, it's since about 2020. I like to joke that my job is really figuring out what my job should be, which changes every 6 months as the needs of the Ethereum Foundation change and adapt over time. So some of the things I'm currently thinking about, what are the long-term challenges facing Ethereum? What institutions could help address those challenges if they existed? How can the EF help create or nurture or support those kinds of institutions? And how should the EF itself change over time as the ecosystem changes, as the needs change, and as all these allied institutions around us come online? So before I started working at the EF, I played a bunch of different roles in the ecosystem. And I worked in the industry for a while. I've seen lots of different parts of it. One of my earliest jobs working in crypto was I worked on an early Bitcoin wallet called CryptoKit. I operated a Bitcoin ATM here in Toronto for about a year in 2015. In 2017, I co-founded ETH Global, and through that, I saw the development of a lot of early DeFi consumer applications on chain. And as Tim mentioned, I've written a lot of blog posts over the years, which I hope are useful to the ecosystem. But through all of this, I still couldn't really explain what we were doing. When I give this talk in front of a crowd, I always hope that gets a laugh line. I could talk about individual applications and tell a coherent story, right? Bitcoin is an application of a blockchain, and we can tell a story there about digital gold. NFTs are a collectible art item. Uniswap is a trading protocol. ENS is a name system. All these things have a pretty clear, coherent explanation. But when we try and tell the larger story, a story that makes sense of all these things and why one common technology enables all of them, despite being so different, I feel like we would always stumble. We're doing a lot of this when we talk about blockchains as a whole, about crypto, even about Ethereum. And we need to get to here. We need to be able to tell a simple story to make sense of this. So about 2 years ago now, I wrote this blog post to try and really answer that question for myself. Enough people have told me that they liked it, that they helped it as a useful frame, that I've tried to continue writing and speaking about these ideas. And I hope it can contribute to this larger project. If blockchains are going to have the impact that we want them to have, they need to explain themselves, right? We're asking the world to someday rely on these systems for just critical civilizational infrastructure, and that requires more than just functioning well. It requires legibility and understanding. Think of it this way. Society as a whole has social software it uses to interpret and understand it and make sense of technology, which technology to use, which technology to rely on. Blockchains have identified an edge case in that software, and we have to fix it. We have to update that social software. So think of this as a proposal, a pull request to our civilization's sense-making software through which it understands new technologies. We're adding some ideas, yes, and some new terminology, but we're also, I hope, deleting a lot of legacy code. So let me tell you a story. At Bell Labs in the 1930s and 40s, Claude Shannon was surrounded by the beginnings of a new age. During the Second World War, he worked on fire control systems and cryptography. And this work led him to think a lot about what we later called information, about a more generalized approach to the systems and materials he was working with. But he didn't use that word at first, information, because it didn't yet have the meaning that it has today. In 1939, he wrote that what he was analyzing was intelligence. It wasn't until later that he and other engineers at Bell Labs started using the word information in a particular way, as a more technical word that referred to a measure or a quantity of a thing. So in 1948, Shannon publishes A Mathematical Theory of Communication, which, as probably many of you know, is really the foundation of computer science, of so much of the technology that we rely on today. And the paper describes a general model for communication of information, defining a source, a transmitter, a noise source, etc. But most importantly, for our purposes, it introduced this idea of information that was not tied to a particular physical form or a particular use. It was a general abstract definition. This paper also introduced the term a bit as this novel idea that there could be a measurable specific unit about information that is common to all forms of information. Now, these historical generalities get tricky, but I think it is generally true that most people alive at the time did not think of information as an abstract property across many different domains the way we do today. Today, it is very natural for us to talk about information as an abstract thing, and that didn't exist 100 years ago. When you look at old definitions, different words that related to information, like information or intelligence or communication, they were all kind of siloed into particular mediums or use cases. They had these kind of different parochial meanings tied to specific stuff. And it's quite striking to look at these and think about how different they are from the way we use these terms today. So this has always struck me as important. We've had information technology, books, language, etc., for thousands of years. But we couldn't articulate that there was this abstract property that united them. Shannon's idea changed this, but it didn't just change his immediate field he was working in, it changed many other fields. As one example, in 1950, Homer Jacobson, who was a chemistry professor in New York, took Shannon's ideas and thought, well, if we can have this abstract model of information, then we could measure the informational capacity of parts of the human body. So he did this for the human ear, and then he also did it for the eye. And then, the most obvious other example is that, of course, Shannon's own ideas from that paper were used to understand DNA. Particularly his ideas about error correction were found to actually exist in our genetic code. We wouldn't understand, the nature of humanity if we didn't have the idea of information. So the idea that all these things shared some common property was novel. It was new. there was a time before we had the concept of information, and there was time after. So what if we are missing something similarly fundamental, but in a different domain? Part 2. As I'm thinking about some of these ideas and working on this blog post, there are clues that we seem to be missing something, right? Here I am, I'm struggling, I'm doing mental gymnastics, trying to tell a coherent story about why all these very different applications are enabled by this thing called a blockchain. One clue is that it always struck me as strange that we would describe blockchains sometimes as trustless, but other times as trustworthy, right? The Bitcoin white paper talks about doing transactions without relying on trust. The Ethereum white paper says that the purpose of cryptocurrency is to eliminate the need for trust. But the Ethereum white paper also says that Ethereum can make applications trustworthy. And popular media like The Economist back in 2015 talked about blockchains in terms of creating trust. And it's not just Ethereum people who talk in trustworthy terms. Here's the Rootstock roadmap talking about the need for RSK to be trustworthy. So what's going on here? I don't think either of these descriptions is wrong. I'm not trying to dunk on anyone. We mean something real when we say that blockchains are trustless, and we mean something real when we say that blockchains are trustworthy. Our language just hasn't caught up with what we know. And as an aside, like contradictions and absurdities like this are always interesting to pay attention to. Sometimes they're just a mere absurdity, but sometimes they reveal like a gap in our abstractions. Sometimes ideas aren't contradicting each other. They're each pointing to something that isn't yet revealed in the map that we're using, and we have to unfold the map or add a new dimension to it to see what we're missing. The second clue is that we talk a lot about how blockchains are different from centralized institutions, but we very rarely talk about what they have in common. And they must have something in common, right? This usual story is that we have, centralized institutions over here, and we have decentralized blockchains over here. We define them in opposition to something that we already understand, but they must have something in common. Why? Well, these things, and really only a narrow set of things, have actually been used to make a global money. If there's only a handful of things in the entire world that have been used to make a global money, they must have something in common, right? Both these things can be used to affect what are basically contracts, conditional logic describing and affecting relationships. They're substitutes for each other. Like there really are people out in the world who have substituted a derivative contract they could have made out of lawyers and legal systems and instead used a blockchain to accomplish the same thing. So there must be some shared property that both of these things have. And it's normal, right, for us to define new technologies in contrast with previous technologies. We did this when we invented cars, right? But at least when we had this story about horseless transportation and horseful transportation, we could obviously just point to a category that they both belong to. They're both vehicles. They're used to move people around. When we moved from a paper-full office to a paperless office, or for digital records and books, again, we were contrasting with what we already understood. But by this time, it was very easy to point to the category of thing that both of these have. But what's our story here, right? We're defining an opposition, but what is the ultra category that they're both part of? And it gets even weirder than that, because this common property, it needs to extend to things like rocks, right? Because we do use gold and other metals and precious objects like gems as money. Just raw physical stuff we find lying around the universe can be money too. So what is the commonality among all these things that makes sense of how we use them? And we'll change rocks here for atoms, just to make that consistent, and you can see where we're going with this. So the diagnosis at the end of this is that it's not that we don't understand blockchains, it's that we don't understand everything else around blockchains. And that is one of the reasons that it's been so hard to reason about them and explain them. All right, part 3, hardness. So let me tell you another simple story in 5 steps. First, our civilization depends on social infrastructure like money and law. These systems need to be dependable, right? They need to behave like we expect them to behave for them to fulfill their function. But it's very difficult to achieve the necessary level of reliability And so far, there's really only 3 ways we know how to do it: using atoms, institutions, and blockchains. These 3 things all have this special property that I've called hardness. They give us this ability to make the future more predictable in the specific ways we require, achieving this required level of reliability. Gold's inflation rate is reliable because it's just kind of a physical property of our planet. A contract is reliable because there's a whole institution made up of people dedicated to enforcing that contract. A smart contract is reliable because it is secured by this combination of cryptography, incentives, and networked software. You can think of each of these 3 things as analogous to building materials like wood or concrete or steel. They're different, they have different properties, but they're part of this larger category, and we can substitute one for the other. You can make a home out of wood, and you can make a home out of concrete. We can compare them. They have different tensile strengths, compressive strengths, durability, etc. They're good for different purposes, and they're even better when used in combination. So this is our story, that atoms, institutions, and blockchains, the thing that they share is this capability for hardness. So I think this is a simpler story, that really human civilization requires making the future more certain. We already do this with atoms, institutions, and blockchains are just a new way of doing that. That's our story. So that's the big picture. Let's talk in a bit more detail and offer a working definition of hardness. So here's what I'm working with right now. Hardness is the capability to make a specific outcome very likely to be true in the future for the purpose of enabling human social coordination. And it can also be used as to describe a measure of the certainty or security of a specific outcome. We can ask, how hard is something? And then each of atoms, institutions, and blockchains let people program hardness to create these social coordination tools that we're familiar with. So let's walk through this definition and talk about the different components of it. So first, hardness is a capability. We use hardness to create specific outcomes that we want. We're really talking about programmable hardness. We're not just talking about like everything in the universe that is certain. We're talking about a pretty narrow set of things which are like socially useful to human beings. One way to think about this is that, when we talk about the Earth, we're really talking about a very narrow slice of the Earth that is most relevant to human beings and our activities and our goals and our dreams, right? It's this, tiny 1% of the actual planet. And similarly, when we talk about hardness, we're not talking about, will the sun rise tomorrow, or, will the components of hydrogen be the same tomorrow? We're talking about these specific things that are the right shape to fit into human society. Secondly, hardness is about a specific outcome. So what is the specific outcome we're talking about? This is where I'm going to introduce another term, the cast. So the cast is the specific outcome that we are making hard through some source. It's the future state of the world that is being made certain or secure. A cast we might want related to a loan might be that if one party doesn't pay the other party back, then the legal system will use increasingly severe threats and actions to force performance. We use institutional hardness, like a legal system, to harden this cast. A cast about gold might be an expectation about how much gold will enter the market each year for the next 20 years. This cast is made hard by just the physical properties of the Earth around us. A cast about ETH might be that this portion of ETH can only be transferred if a transaction is signed using a specific private key. And we use blockchain hardness to harden this cast. In practice, we're always interacting with bundles of casts woven together. Casts about, if you own gold and hold it in a bank, then you care about casts about gold supply, casts about the strength of your bank's vault, about the strength of the legal agreement between you and the bank, and also the reliability of the legal system in your country. Why am I coining a new term here? Again, is it overkill? Well, we want terminology that is generalized across any type of hardness, right? The words we usually have to talk about specific outcomes made hard by things are really tied to the implementation or the source of hardness. We want generalizable terminology that's not tied to the source of hardness. And cast has some useful connotations as a word in this context. So thirdly, hardness is about enabling human social coordination, right? It is a specific kind of purpose. It's not about everything that is reliable. Hardness is specific to where we're creating casts of a particular kind that shape human incentives and coordination. The things like institutions and blockchains are so powerful because they let us make extremely customizable casts that are really specific to what we need, right? Like the content of a marriage agreement, or a complex loan, or things that involve all these like details that are really specific to what is going to shape and influence human behavior, and requires a sophisticated tool set to make them. This also means that hardness needs to be legible. And here's where we could fork off to another blog post I wrote that is all about, well, it's not just that hardness needs to actually be hard, it's that people need to understand that it is, right? If you want to propose to the world a future state that you're going to be making more certain, in order for people to coordinate around on it, they need to actually believe that that is true if they're going to buy into your version of the world and use it as a coordinating tool. Next, we can also talk about hardness as a measure of the certainty or security of a specific outcome. So hardness is always measurable in theory, even if it's difficult to do so in practice. So for example, let's go back to the gold example. How hard is the cast that a specific amount of gold will enter the market each year for the next 20 years? Well, one way to approach this is as a measurement of probability, right? We can gather all the information that exists in the world about the supply of gold in the earth, about the industry constructed to extract it, about all the different things that influence this. And then we can make a guess that there's an 80% likelihood that this amount of gold will enter the market. Another way of looking at it is as a cost measurement, right? We could ask, what would it cost someone to create a world where the cast turns out to be false? What would it cost to break the cast, in other words? And there's always a price, right? If you have the resources of a nation state, you could certainly reduce the amount of gold being produced in the world through international treaties or the use of violence. But you could also probably break the cast in the other direction if you go get an asteroid, mostly made out of gold, and bring it back to the Earth. So next, we can talk about the different sources of hardness, right? And in AIB, there's these three things: atoms, institutions, and blockchains. Hardness comes from a specific source. There's a reason that it is hard. And each has these different properties that make them useful in different contexts. So here's where we shift to talking about each of these three things and what they might be used for. One thing I like about this framework is that it lets us ask, I think, like interesting and deeper questions. In the same way that Homer Jacobson was able to apply the ideas of Claude Shannon to understand things outside of the context in which it worked, I think we can also use this idea of hardness to explore interesting questions about many parts of our society, right? We can ask for each source of hardness, what are its properties? How is this hardness made in this case? What are the strengths and weaknesses of this source of hardness? And by doing so, understand more about what it is good for. So let's take them one by one. Atom hardness, as we said, is when we source hardness from just physical properties of our universe. It includes physical stuff, literal atoms, but also other naturally occurring properties that we might put to social use. Examples of this could be any time we've used physical objects as a money, whether that be gold or beads or yapstones. It includes when we record some important fact on a deed, and the literal deed itself or the bearer bond has some important, meaningful connection to whether a thing is true or not. It includes when we build castles to defend our possessions, and the vaults that hold pieces of paper and gold and all these other things in a secure place that effect property rights in a real way. Atom hardness has many advantages. These seem obvious, right? But as far as we can tell, nature is automatically enforced. There's a shared state that we're all part of. There's only one we have access to. And there's this universal rule set that seems to apply the same everywhere. Very useful properties if you're trying to coordinate around something. But it also has weaknesses. One is that we're limited to properties that just kind of accidentally coincide with human needs. A way of thinking about this is that if you're an architect and you want to build this cool home with a rock face as part of the wall, you kind of just need to find a rock face that works. You can't make one, right? You need to forage essentially for the properties that you want and then build around them. Another way of putting this is that, we can't just announce a new kind of gold. We can't say to the universe, like, gold's all right, but we'd really love if there was actually a lower rate of inflation, if you could spread it around the world in a more fair way according to our conventions and borders, and the weight issue is kind of slowing down adoption. We can't do that. We're just limited to what nature gave us. Another problem with atom hardness is that it's pretty limited programmability. We can't make we can't deal with a divorce, like a complex human thing with many components to it, through atom hardness. We need a more flexible and subtle tool for that. And the other is that casts made of atom hardness are undermined by increasing human control over nature, right? As one example, building your economy on shells for money or even rare gems works for a while until your society expands into ecosystems where those shells are plentiful, or you make contact with a trading civilization that has many of those shells and then destroys the foundation of your economy. Humanity might someday face that same problem with gold, of course, if Elon Musk and others succeed at obtaining one of these gold asteroids. Another example is that in the past, there were casts about the speed and frequency of market trading that were basically enforced by atom hardness, right? There just was a limit to how fast people could shout at each other on a trading floor. There was a limit to how fast that communication could happen. It was atom hard. But with new technology, we undermine that cast. There are, now as more trading is being done just digitally through software, suddenly we realize that actually we don't want trading to happen that fast because weird things can happen. There can be problems with markets that way. And so we remade the cast out of institutional hardness by introducing regulations that enforce a certain speed of trading and create rules around it. This is a common theme in human civilization. So moving on to institutional hardness. This is where we're sourcing hardness from groups of humans organized into formal institutions. Legal systems, legislatures, police forces, governments, all institutional hardness. All these things are examples of where we've used basically collections of people who behave a certain way consistently over time to give hardness to things. We created castes that gave order to our societies, punishing antisocial behavior. We made hardness as a platform by letting anyone create their own castes, made hard by institutions. We created castes that spawned new assets and provided sources of credit to growing economies. And institutional hardness has many advantages, right? It's very programmable. The only limit is like what instructions you can give people, and people are pretty flexible and smart, and we can write down these rules so institutions can take really complex and subtle instruction sets. There's a very large design space of possible castes because institutions can go out in the world and do things. A police officer can come to your home and search your documents or arrest you. Institutions have a lot of reach and scale. And institutions are made of people. And as we know, people are good. But institutional hardness also has many weaknesses. It's limited by borders. This is a bad map projection, but a useful resource, which is trying to understand the quality of the rule of law in different countries around the world. Depending where you live, the institutional hardness available to you might not be very useful or very hard at all. Institutional hardness is exposed to political or state failure. If your government fails or can't agree on something, then the things made hard by institutions might just stop working. It's often very opaque, right? We're all familiar with institutions that hid things from the world and as a result harm lots of people because they were very opaque institutions. They have a high startup cost. It's very expensive to create new types or new forms of institution and iterate on them. And they're made of people. And as we know, people are bad. And our reliance on institutional hardness has increased over time. One problem with software eating the world is that software is made out of institutions. And as many forms of software take more power and have a greater influence on our lives, we're really giving more and more influence to certain institutions as well. Finally, blockchain hardness. Satoshi's invention, of course, was not just Bitcoin, but this kernel of something grander, this general purpose technique of creating digital hardness. And it has many strengths, right? There's through the internet, universal global access. It's made of software, and anyone can write software, can pick up and start learning Solidity. Anyone can write smart contract, but very few people can write a law. Degrees of hardness can be transparent and auditable. Anyone can, verify for themselves various important component states of the blockchain. It has low startup costs and is cheap to iterate. Many people can try out different things, different protocols, different mechanisms on a blockchain state and try them out over time. And they're secured by market incentives, and markets are rational. But it also has many weaknesses. They require technological civilization. The blockchain hardness tech tree was not available to humanity until very recently. We required, inventing the internet as well as discovering a lot of cryptography to make it work. It's made of software, and people can write bad software. And we're all familiar with many cases of, poorly written code or hacks that have happened in this ecosystem. The scope of CAS is limited kind of to digital environments, to what is on chain. And they're secured by market incentives. And as we know, markets are irrational. So what? So why does all this matter? I'm going to give you two reasons here. One is, for me, it makes blockchains start to make a lot more sense. Like, come back to what we talked at the beginning about trustless versus trustworthy. This is now very simple to explain. When we say that blockchains are trustless, what we really mean is that their hardness doesn't depend on a person or an institution. It is a different source of hardness than we are accustomed to. When we say that blockchains are trustworthy, it means that they have hardness. So we just didn't have a word for the thing behind this, so we had to use this confusing terminology. It also explains why private or centralized blockchains are not very interesting. Like, a blockchain that is not decentralized just collapses back into being an institution. If it's just three banks, behind a screen, and they're running the validators and using an EVM, it's still just a thing secured by institutional hardness. The novelty of blockchains is not the EVM, it is this different source of hardness. It might be a good way of being an institution, it might be the future for some institutions, but it's very distinct from what the broader crypto community is trying to do. It also gives us a useful map of the kind of breakdown of how different people and different application areas think about what blockchains are for. Some people on the left of this diagram think about blockchains as competing with and replacing certain kinds of institutional hardness. This is very much the ethos behind Bitcoin. You can just even say it's the ethos behind ENS versus DNS, the more kind of DeFi aspects of the ecosystem as well. But then some people are already thinking about, well, we have this new thing, this new source of hardness, and it can probably do things that institutions never could. We've opened up completely new territory, a green field or a blue sky place to build autonomous worlds, to do weird new things with. It also, I think, helps raise our ambitions a bit. I didn't just, the thing I'm most excited about in blockchains is not just any specific application area. It is this potential for a bigger story, that we're not just reinventing certain institutional things or, disrupting certain industries. It's that we have this much bigger vision to improve and expand the materials that we use to build our civilization, to lower the cost of those tools so that everyone on Earth has access to them, and not just the people in some places at some times. And to help humanity keep playing these infinite games by letting more people propose new kinds of rules. The other way that this is important, and this is where we connect more firmly to protocol world, is that I think this gives us a point of leverage for understanding protocols. One way of looking at this is protocols as a user or consumer of hardness. There are many protocols that are built on top of other sources of hardness, right? Many safety protocols in an employment context, they require legal enforcement to be useful or to take effect or have their biggest impact. There are many protocols that are built on top of the Ethereum protocol, like, for example, Uniswap. But another way we see protocols pop up is protocols as a source of hardness, right? Blockchains are protocols, and they contain many discrete protocol components. Institutions, you might also say, are partly made of protocols, right? You might think of civil procedure rules in the context of law, or protocols of diplomacy and state in an international context, or communication protocols, or decision-making protocols. There are many protocol-like things inside of institutions that make them what they are. But then there are also protocols that are neither blockchains nor institutions, really, that could be said to be creating hardness within specific domains, right? Like a nuclear safety protocol hardens the cast, this power plant won't melt down. So maybe I've got to change the title of this talk, right? Maybe there's something broader happening here. Maybe protocols overlap to some degree with institutions and blockchains. Maybe they're inside these boxes. Maybe they're overlapping it. So I want to end with just a couple questions to, I guess, progress this conversation and maybe get your help. One is that if protocols are part of our story, then how should we conceptualize the different sources of hardness, right? Is it atoms, institutions, blockchains, and protocols? Or is it that atoms are one thing and then there's institution and protocols and blockchain protocols? Or maybe it's something entirely different. Maybe the real distinction is between this foraged hardness we find in nature, atoms, etc., as opposed to human-made hardness like institutions, like blockchains, like protocols. Second question. Maybe the notion of hardness that I've talked about here so far needs to be expanded to include a much wider range of making the future more certain. Venkatesh wrote this great blog post, In Search of Hardness, riffing on some of these ideas, and he really kind of expands this a little bit to talk about hardness in a more general form, right? He gives examples of hardness that I wouldn't have thought about when I was writing AIB, about military leaders putting hardness into their operations using protocols, or the way that sports coaches are creating more predictability using protocols for their athletes. So maybe we need to go a bit broader here. And so if that's the case, then how do we make sense of the story between AIB, which do feel different from these more small p protocol sources of hardness? Because they do seem distinct in their scale and how we use them. I whipped up this very simple diagram on two axes. On the bottom we have its programmableness, and on the y-axis we have the potential for scale. And it seems like many protocols are in this kind of zone of, they're more like specific and single use, that there are a safety protocol is designed for one thing and it does that thing, and traffic rules are designed for that one thing. But blockchains and big institutions and even atoms to some degree are really these like big generative sources of hardness. They feel more like platforms where a lot of the protocols we talk about and that Venkatesh talks in that blog post seem a bit more like applications or more narrow specific things. So those are the two questions. I hope that you found this interesting, at least. I hope that you have critical questions, and we'll go away thinking about this. And thank you very much for your time.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Josh, for that great presentation. Got lots of fun conversation in both the YouTube and the private chat. A few people have some thoughts, and so I will bring some people to the stage. I think Gordon and Dorian and Trent. So we'll start bringing some people in here. Trent is on stage. Dorian's on the stage. Gordon is here, and I think we'll bring in Juan as well. Let's start with Trent.
Hey, Josh. Thanks for the talk. The thing that comes to mind is I'm sure there's like a pretty rich literature on like rating the dependability of institutions, because the first thing that came to my head was nobody really agrees how to rate the decentralization of blockchains, or at least it's really hard to, and I don't think we've really come to consensus on like how to actually put concrete numbers to, or like get a holistic rating system for blockchains, which underpins the hardness or underpins the dependability of this as a mechanism. So and like thinking about, how countries will rate like the how open elections are, or like democracy index, things like that probably exist on the level of institutions. But I imagine there's probably a really wide variability, but maybe prior art that we can look to when it comes to decentralization.
Yeah. So two things come to mind right away. I guess one is that, like, I think what's a foundational thing here is that we are making guesses ultimately about what will happen in the future. Like when we talk about is a thing hard or not, you don't actually know, right? Like we can make our best informed guess that, the economic incentives of Ethereum are going to keep functioning and that they're going to prevent certain attacks, and that gives us some confidence that a thing will continue happening in the future. But ultimately, it's an unknown, right? We are making a best informed guess. And so I think that's part of the reason why that no one quite agrees on how we should think about this in either a blockchain context or an institutional one, is that ultimately we're making our best attempts, and there's always going to be potential for people to disagree and to argue about, which factors are most important for this thing actually being hard in the future or not. The other thing that comes to mind is that I think it sucks that our ecosystem has not produced better ways of comparing maybe the decentralization or hardness of different blockchains, different parts of this ecosystem. I think attempts to focus on like quantifying decentralization is even a bit of a misdirection, because ultimately I think what we're trying to do is quantify, is it hard or not, right? Like understanding, is this blockchain reliable? You also depend on things that don't have much to do with decentralization, but have a lot to do with like, is this cryptography secure or not? I think some people try and fudge it into this is all components of decentralization, but I've never seen a very kind of good coherent take on that. So I think we should just kind of go direct to like hardness is the end and decentralization is the tool that we use to achieve that in this context. And we should just focus on what kinds of decentralization actually make something hard or not. Not that that's a trivial task, but I think that's a better starting point.
Yeah, I guess we're starting to see like stablecoin rating agencies pop up. Maybe they'll just be like more and more sophisticated takes on actually how to rate the dependability of chains as time goes on.
Yeah, and the one, I guess, exception I should say to that is that I always want to shill L2Beat, which is this amazing resource for comparing different Ethereum L2s, which if you're not from this world are basically kind of like sub-chains that are anchored onto Ethereum, but are already like the user-facing layer of Ethereum from here on out. And L2Beat is a great resource that I think is really trying to answer the question of like, how hard are these different L2s? Can you rely on this? Why can you rely on it? Why does it work, etc. I wish we had L2Beat for a lot of things, not just in the blockchain world.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh and Trent. We got some more questions. I'm going to add Venkatesh and Seth to the chat here. Juan, you had a bunch of questions in the YouTube. Maybe you want to take a moment to ask any of those that didn't get answered during the presentation.
Yes. Hi, Josh. One of my questions was about you mentioned legibility, I think, and how do we make what I wrote in YouTube was like a sculptor discovers hardness in wood or steel through empirical means when he tries to do something with those materials, right? And someone who's not a sculptor or an expert in this can easily discover also this hardness through empirical means. But how do we reach this kind of discoverability in more complex things like institutions or blockchains if you're not an expert?
For sure. Yeah, you will love that other blog post I mentioned, which is called "Making Sense of Trust Experience." So it's very much like on that specific topic. And I guess like what I try to do there is articulate a bit of the basic idea there is that there's this thing called trust experience, and it refers to all of the different ways that we figure out, can we rely on something or not, right? If you think about, UX is about interacting with a thing and like touching it and using it in the present. Trust experience is about our own expectations about the future. It's like the UX of the future in a sense. Like when people go to use, something they want to rely on, they're asking themselves like, well, like, do other people use this? Has it broken before? Do I understand the principles by which this thing is reliable? And so by my understanding, can I use it? And there's a bunch of different ways that we do this, even if we don't have practical experience, right? I mean, most people don't understand like, the engineering principles that secure their home if they live in a high rise. And, but we come to rely on these things. One is just that we get good enough at doing it that stuff doesn't break. And so we kind of form this expectation in groups and societies that it's going to work. Another is that we create, cultures, institutions of experts whose job it is to translate to a more general public. In the context of law, that's what a lawyer is, right? Not everyone is going to be an expert in all of the legal realities around them that shape their behavior. And so we have a special cast of people that we pay to explain stuff to us. There's many other kind of cases like that when it comes to maybe more financial products. So in the blockchain context, I think we need to try everything. I think that like one way that blockchains can be very effective in the world is if they have the best trust experience of anything out there. If if anyone with the skills to audit it can audit it, so it's all transparent. If there's really great resources for different communities of experts who can, be trusted to explain things. If there's, even in some cases, rules and regulations that, shape people towards the things that are safe or not, or, standards within the industry, that kind of stuff. There's a lot of ways societies have solved this problem for different sources of hardness in the past, and we can learn from them and also do better.
Just a quick, this makes me think about Boeing and also pharmaceutical scandals that have happened recently. And those are like systems in which precisely non-experts, we put our trust in this. Like, we don't know how the airplane works, but we trust like, hey, it's Boeing. They're experts, engineers, etc. And now we have discovered in a very unfortunate way that they cannot be trusted.
Yeah, it's a great example. Like there's no one size fits all solution here, and I think there is also an element of that this is about the future, and it's about things that we can't always have a complete handle on. There's always going to be a bit of uncertainty. It's also one reason why I think that like a variety of approaches can be very important, especially in a very nascent field, where people can try different things and experiment in a safe way, so we can learn as much as possible, as fast as possible about what's going to work and what isn't going to work.
All right, thanks you guys. Seth, you had some interesting comments you care to share in here?
Sure. I don't know if they're fully baked, but one, thank you for the talk. I thought it's a great paper, and it's great to hear again, very useful thinking. I guess I'm wondering if hardness is sort of a generalized property. It seems very situational in each case, right? Like it's sort of, I don't have the quite right analogy here, but it's sort of like the finger trap is only hard in one respect, or sort of on one axis. And I feel like a lot of these concepts of hardness, even around blockchains, right, which sort of presupposes the internet, is incredibly not hard in some ways. And so I think the term, I keep coming back to sort of, it just seems like sort of what you're looking for is invariance over time. That's not as fun as hardness, but I'm trying to distinguish those things. And then, is this a general property, or is it always contextual?
Mm-hmm.
I guess to point on the question.
Yeah. I think honestly, I'm not sure. Like I think I'm still, and I hope many people are still chewing on this idea and trying to figure out like what is the right way to break this down and structure this concept. I think there's like a mix of things that end up being part of it. One is, the property is almost more like a shared capability. And I think that's maybe that's a distinction too between some of the more small p protocol stuff I talked about and like the big ones about institutions of blockchains, is that like they give individual people a capability to make something hard. And I think that shared capability is distinct from then like the quality of hardness that is given by that capability. I kind of, as I said, like I'm defining the term in the purposes of this talk and the blog post to be like a word that can be used either to refer to this capability or to refer to a measurable capacity. I'm not exactly sure how to square that. Maybe these are distinct ideas that need to have like distinct terminology for them. and maybe they are just different that way. I don't know if that directly addresses your question, but that's what I first thought of. I definitely think that a lot of it is contextual as well. Obviously, it's tricky though, right? Like in a sense of, you know, how hard is a contract is extremely contextual and dependent on all these really complicated, you know, social and almost political factors. So maybe it's just always contextual, and there's no way of getting down quite to the root of it. But yeah, that's what I thought of when I asked the question.
I really appreciate the intellectual honesty there, but also that I felt there was a lump in the carpet around those two use cases as well. And so I think that there is something really interesting to explore here. And contextual doesn't mean bad, for what it's worth, in my opinion. So I think there's still all kinds of useful stuff, but thank you.
Thanks, Seth.
Awesome. Gordon, you've had a bunch to say in the comments here. Do you have any any formulated questions or just things you'd like to present here?
I guess I'll just say thanks for this. This is a very generative frame to look at this through. I know I've in the past, when trying to explain this, have talked about enforcing invariance and the way that we use institutions and authority and power to basically try to enforce those invariants, and that we can use math in some circumstances to do so. But I think this is actually, you know, I'd asked earlier if it was synonymous with invariance, but I think it's a more flexible concept. It's like a semi-formal maybe, and applies to more areas. I don't know that I have a specific question, but I was kind of curious if you had bumped into this classic paper, Timin, Tribes, Institutions, Markets, Networks, because I felt like there's a through line here of talking about, you know,
No,
I guess.
I read that.
Okay. Well, maybe
sounds like
maybe
I like
leave
it.
it there. Yeah. I feel like it maybe one way of reframing that paper would be to look at these different forms: tribes, institutions, markets, and networks as different containers for hardness, or different ways of expressing or creating hardness. I guess I'll leave it there, but suffice to say, you've generated a lot of follow-up questions in my mind.
Cool.
Thank you.
Well, I hope that if you can post a link in the chat, I will definitely check it out later. Thank you.
Venkatesh, question from you.
Yeah, so I'll echo what others have said. This has been a super generative concept for me personally in my own thinking, but also actually in thinking about managing the summer protocols program itself. And that's where kind of my main question is. We are right now doing the SOP2 application reviews, and reading them, I don't want to criticize particular applications, but a general pattern I see in applications that strike me as weak is, so since the theme of this year's program is taking an existing protocol and improving it, the pattern in hardness terms is they look at a protocol that has some flaws and issues, maybe some parts are nebulous and illegible, some parts are legible and clear. And what they end up doing is they add structure to the illegible and nebulous parts and subtract hardness when they should be doing the exact reverse, right? So taking an illegible norm and rule and formulating it precisely in a structured way doesn't actually help, especially if you're doing it while actually subtracting hardness, right? So maybe there's an example I have in mind is Wild West contracts are enforced by cowboys shooting at each other. So the contract structure itself is very soft, as in like handshake, I agree to sell you so many cattle, and if you renege on your deal, I'm going to shoot you. That's the protocol. And you replace that with let's put our guns away and like make structured contracts that we both sign. You've added structure and removed hardness. So I'm not recommending we go back to gun enforced contract culture, but that's kind of the problem I see. So what's sort of your reaction to this, and how would you formulate kind of like a design principle or heuristic here for people who want to improve protocols not falling into this trap?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, what it makes me think of right away is that I think we're very much all the children of institutions. Institutions rule the world. And one, I think, kind of important piece of this idea is just the idea that there are other sources of hardness other than institutions. And I think we have this bias towards always just wanting to add institutional layers to things to improve them, like the natural idea that maybe someone in an application context has, like, yes, we'll make this more like a legal system. We'll make this more like the institutional thing I'm familiar with, because that's the better version, the more civilized version, whatever it has. The other is that, I think all people in our societies have trouble tolerating softness or uncertainty, or like these more nebulous things, even if there's some indication or evidence that having things left undefined can produce better outcomes on the aggregate when people all follow a set of rules that are undefined. It is hard for that to be defensible. I think this also comes from a bit of an institutional bias, where institutions frequently don't want uncertainty for various reasons in different contexts. Sometimes that's about liability. Sometimes that's about, just kind of political reasons of wanting to avoid, certain outside consequences and a lack of tolerance for risk. But there's really like a bias to avoid that. I'm not sure what the right, rubric would be, but I guess maybe the answer is just to like be very clear about what the goal is. I think if someone can really articulate what they're actually trying to do when they're trying to change or improve a protocol and be very specific about that, it's a bit easier to step away from the default patterns of let's institutionalize this or let's formalize this. I'm sure there's a better answer than that, Venkat, but that's where I got to right now.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to formulate the principle. I think one cue I'm taking is from Nassim Taleb's anti-fragile kind of line of thinking, which I think is, and skin in the game and all this sort of like related set of concepts. I think he's close, but he's making it a little too personal, like skin in the game stakes. They like reduce this hard. I think his mistake is reducing hardness to personal incentives, and they're not exactly the same thing. So that's not it. But an example that the anti-fragile crowd uses, I think, is illuminating here, which is take the difference between doing strength training with free weights versus strength training with machine weights. So the machine weights are more structured. Weights move on like guides, and it's safer, but it's not going to build muscle and like strength and flexibility as well as free weights. So that kind of example, I think, helps people think about this more clearly. But yeah, so that's just a closing thought on my question. But I also had a quick comment on the invariance thing. So I think I disagree with Gordon. I think actually hardness is a less flexible concept, and that's a good thing. It's a feature. And what I mean by that is when you think about invariance in mathematics, it's usually, integrals of motion or conserved quantities in like a physics equation where it's like, sum of potential energy plus kinetic energy is constant in a non-dissipative system, right? So that's a constant of motion and in its integral, but it can't quite be used as hardness. So I think hardness is more restrictive than at least the mathematical and physics sense of invariance and constants of motion, and I think that's a good thing. So literally, it's like a swinging pendulum has invariance of motion, namely conserved energy, but it does not have hardness. Whereas if you kind of like lock the pendulum down on one side, it has hardness, right? So I just wanted to like make that fine distinction there, and that's all I had.
Thanks, Venkat.
Cool. Dorian.
Yeah, thanks, Josh, and thanks, Josh. So when I first encountered this concept of hardness, it made me think about how I've used the term just in my own work, to the extent that, say, when a piece of data is conforms to a very strict syntax, for example, like a date, ISO date or something like that, like that's a hard piece of data. Or like when you like something on social media, like that is a hard data point that is unambiguously computable by a deterministic system. Or when you're writing logic and like your if else all covers the entire set of possibilities, versus there could be cases that might show up in the in a condition that is not covered by the conditions that you create. And so as it pertains to the legibility of smart contracts, there's another sort of a group that I've been part of where one of the people is really into formal proofs. and he just mentioned offhand the other day that that Tezos in particular uses some kind of like total functional formal, like a reduced non-Turing complete language for its smart contracts. And I was wondering, since you can usually turn those into some kind of a diagram or some kind of a representation that you can just look at and be like, yep, there's no rug pulls in here. I'm wondering about like the extent to which like that kind of work, and as far as Solidity is concerned, and just being able to look at a smart contract and see, you know, there's no rug pulls in this without having to go through, you know, Solidity code line by line.
Right. I mean, I guess the closest equivalent in the Ethereum ecosystem is there's lots of work being done on like various kinds of formal verification of just, you know, having much greater assurances that certain components of code or contracts themselves do not contain certain features or are not going to be able to do certain things. I don't really know anything about Tezos, so I can't answer much about that. But yeah, there's definitely lots of work there on that. Like that's a, you know, just the much higher bar of risk when it comes to smart contract code has created reasons for people to, you know, invest a lot of time and energy in projects that, you know, take us to the next level of code security and of like assurances about the content and function of code. So there is lots of work being done on that, and I could definitely like point you in some directions or connect you some people if you're interested in learning more about it.
And so then Venkat recently did this diagram where he's got the entire world like teetering on
I saw it, yeah.
oil, yeah. And so I guess my question there has to do with, you know, to what extent are you sort of red teaming the hardness of Ethereum and like imagining scenarios where the hardness is compromised?
I mean, this is definitely something that, sorry, the question is, to what extent am I or other people red teaming? How could Ethereum's hardness be compromised? Yeah. It's definitely a thing that many people do in many different contexts, right? Like Ethereum is big and complex and has a lot of surface area. So, you know, in one sense, a lot of what the, you know, teams and research groups and client teams do on the consensus layer is very much about that of, you know, how do we think about attacks that could happen that would, you know, break Ethereum and undermine its hardness. You know, on the totally different end of the spectrum, there are lots of people who think about, you know, long-term relationships to institutions and, you know, what institutional capture could look like and how, you know, governments, corporations, et cetera, in the past have, you know, taken advantage of and slowly gained control over new technologies. There's a great book called The Master Switch by Tim Wu that, you know, covers the history of many different kinds of technologies and how slowly they move from a more decentralized Wild West to something that is more and more controlled by a smaller number of parties. And I think a huge challenge for our ecosystem is how do we resist that? How do we ensure that doesn't happen again?
Thank you.
Thanks, Dorian.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Josh, for this great talk. And yeah, for all of you watching and listening, we will see you all next week, April 24th, same time, same place for a researcher salon with a couple of the SOP1 cohort. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.